What do we learn from an insight observation? By Venerable Rungruan Papa Saro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. The main objective of performing an insight observation is to see what is happening inside an inner mind as what it really is. In seeing an individual phenomenon, we can realize that each of these phenomena arises and fades away, and it changes from one state to another state by a certain cause and effect, not by anyone's control, so we can conclude that it is impermanent, deteriorating, and no self. Then by considering a series of these changing states of mind, then we can realize a mind processing, and we have a perfect observation. Then we can trace the whole mind processing, and seeing the process of dependent origination. Therefore, by having a perfect insight observation, we may be able to see what exactly the Buddha saw on the day of his enlightenment. Seeing an individual phenomenon is essential, and by seeing the cause and effect of individual phenomenon, then we can see the connection of each phenomenon as a whole mind processing in the process of dependent origination, which is an ultimate path for an enlightenment, for the cessations of all finest defilements at craving, clinging, ignorance, and taints. In Buddhism, learning the truths of life within nature is not just done by believing in what the Buddha's words, but we have to perform the Buddhist practice in accord to the Buddha's teaching, and then experiencing the truths of life within nature as it really is, seeing the truths of life within nature. In performing an insight observation, we will experience the reality of nature from an insight observation, and after collecting all the necessary information of the truths of life within nature, then by applying the Four Noble Truths analysis on the data, and then a knowledge of what really a life is, as a cognitive learning process is gained in a wisdom study as follows. After performing an insight observation of the four mindfulness foundations with the 7 factors for enlightenment, then applying the principle of investigation of 7 foundations, aspects, of investigations on arising phenomena, and then having the 3 aspects of insight investigations on the whole mind processing. And finally applying the Four Noble Truths analysis to resolve the finest defilements in the process of dependent origination. As the mind is developed up to this point, not only a whole system of mind will be observed, but also all the origins of finest defilements are detected during the insight observations. In the last part of the 4 mindfulness foundations, the Buddha completed the sutta with a description of the 4 noble truths leading to wisdom development after performing insight observations. That is, after the insight observations, all necessary data of mind are collected for analyzing research on Dharma. The introspective learning on the arising mental phenomena during the observations is based on the principle of investigation of the 7 foundations, aspects, of investigations on arising phenomena, and the 3 aspects of insight investigations on the whole mind processing as follows.
During performing the mindfulness observations, one can realize a stream of consciousness in such a way that every time when having a consciousness, there is an arising object of consciousness in related with the 5 aggregates of being. At every instant of seeing a mental phenomenon, then having an insight investigation on the object of consciousness in 7 aspects of consideration step by step as follows. 1. During performing an insight observation, then contemplating on the mind at a particular mental phenomenon, to realize the arising of the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. That is, what a mind processing is simply an arising and ceasing of the object of consciousness related to the 5 aggregates of being.
This mental phenomenon can be viewed as a particular state of mind by having a mindfulness observing on an object of consciousness for an investigation, or it also can be realized as a mind processing through the 6 sense bases. And by doing so, we can the reality of life in the process of dependent origination.
2. Now we carefully observe on a particular arising of object of consciousness. We can realize the cause of the arising of the object of consciousness related to the 5 aggregates of being. That is, whatsoever object of consciousness arising, is dependently caused by something previously happening before. With regard to this aspect, the Buddha explained the law of cause and effect in nature as follows. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. 3. In accord to the law of cause and effect, when the particular object of consciousness is arisen, then it is subject to destruction, fading away, and cessation as well. Naturally, each of the arising object of consciousness related to the 5 aggregates will cease by itself. And if the mind has nothing to attach and to hold up with, then the mind will has nothing to mix up in the later part of mind processing in accord to the process of dependent origination. With regard to this aspect, the Buddha explained that, whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. 4. Now we can develop a technique to release the object of consciousness related to the 5 aggregates subject to cling, so-called, the release of the 5 aggregated subject to cling. With regard to this aspect, the Buddha explained in one occasion that the mind is no self. Then the mind will naturally be able to release the object of consciousness with no attachment as follows. The form, body, is no self. For if form were self, this form would not lead to affliction, and it would be possible to determine form. Let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. But because form is no self, form leads to affliction, and it is not possible to determine form. Let my form be thus. Let my form not be thus. Feeling is no self. Perception is no self. Volitional formations are no self. Consciousness is no self. 5. We also can verify the particular object of consciousness as wholesome or not, by checking if it will be beneficial to the mind or not. That is, the mindfulness will become steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated in peace. 6. On the contrary, if the particular object of consciousness is unwholesome, then the mind will become disturbing, struggling, burning, and irritating, and unconcentrated in peace.
Note, in the early part of the observation, it may be easy to determine whether an arising phenomenon of both rough defilements and middle defilements is wholesome or unwholesome, but as we dwell into the origin of the defilement such as finest defilement, especially the sensual pleasure which will serve with an immediate satisfaction to most people, but later it will be harmful. Therefore, it requires a careful investigation to study on the effect of the arising phenomenon to determine if it is wholesome or unwholesome.
With regard to this aspect, the Buddha explained in one occasion that in considering on either the benefit or the harm of an arising phenomenon, the Buddha warned that we should not necessarily make a decision based on individual and social judgments, but instead we should investigate on the result of what really happens to the mind itself as follows. In performing a Buddhist practice, when the phenomenon is happening, no matter we like it or not, there are 4 possibilities to respond as follows. The arising phenomenon that may be generally considered as satisfactory, good, by individual judgments and social norms, and if we doing so, and as a result really it is beneficial, good, to life. The arising phenomenon that may be generally considered as satisfactory, good, by individual judgments and social norms, and if we doing so, and as a result really it is unbeneficial and even harmful, bad, to life. The arising phenomenon that may be generally considered as unsatisfactory, bad, by individual judgments and social norms, and if we doing so, and as a result really it is beneficial, good, to life. The arising phenomenon that may be generally considered as unsatisfactory, bad, by individual judgments and social norms, and if we doing so, and as a result really it is unbeneficial and even harmful, bad, to life. Therefore, when considering whether something is beneficial or harmful, good or bad, It should be verified by realizing if the mind is wholesome or not, because the wholesome one will make the mind becoming steadied internally, composed, unified, and concentrated. This is a real benefit to life.
In Buddhism, the morality is a collection of what is right or wrong as a social norm. We study on the morality as a guideline to live with others. However, when study on the mind and the wisdom, now we can really realize what the mind will be, whether it is beneficial or unbeneficial to life. At this point of development, we can realize that the wholesome one will benefit the mind to become internally steadied, composed, unified, and concentrated. This is clearly beneficial to life. While the unwholesome one will harm the mind to become internally struggling with craving, desire, lust, shaky, and non-concentrated, which is clearly non-beneficial to life. The Buddhist practice is a wholesome cognition experiment to improve the quality of mind.
7. After understanding and realizing the benefit and the harm of an arising mental phenomenon within the mind, now we will gain insight wisdom, knowing the cause and effect of whatsoever happening within the mind, and in case when the arising mental phenomenon is unwholesome which will be harmful to the mind, then by having a mindfulness to abandon the phenomenon, and then the mind will be liberated from the troubling by wisdom. This is because of when the mind has nothing to hold up with, then the mind will has nothing to mix up with latent dispositions with ignorance in volitional formations, and then there is no origination of taint, and this is the way to completely cease all defilements from the mind by wisdom. With regard to this aspect, the Buddha explained in one occasion that by realizing that the object of consciousness will arise and fade away, then the mind is liberated. This is the way to liberate the mind. The mind has nothing to be attached with, then the mind will not cling on any object of consciousness in relation to the 5 aggregates of being. Thus the mind is liberated and being free from any arising of taint within the mind processing. After the completion of the fully investigations on each particular mental phenomena, then extending the investigation into the mind processing in 3 areas of studying as follows. 1. Considering everything in the world as just an element in nature. That is, everything already exists in nature as it is. There is no self that creates or owns these mental phenomena. In particular, the mind is a natural process that is caused by certain cause and effect in nature, then realizing that life is no self. Note: the notion of element in Buddhism implies that everything and all phenomena already exist in nature, saying the nature is a creator, there is creator as a self in any form of assumption, and all components of the nature are impermanent, deteriorating, and therefore they are no self. 2. Observing the mind processing as a natural process starting from the 6 sense bases, then starting to realize the beginning of the mind processing, that the mind is simply a natural process, and it is really no self. Note: the 6 sense bases are very important because it is a starting of mind processing. In this investigation we can realize that any consciousness at the 6 sense bases is arising and ceases. Therefore we can conclude that a consciousness is also impermanent, deteriorating, and no self as well. 3. By making an inside observation throughout the whole process of the dependent origination, starting from the 6 sense bases, contact, sensation and feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, decay and death, ignorance, volitional formations, consciousness, name and form, and internally reflowing in 6 sense bases, and so on. And as long as we still keep on having a study on the 3 related subjects of the truths of life within nature, including the study on the element, these are the truths of nature, especially the realization that a life is a part of nature. The study on the 6 sense bases, these are the truths of nature about how life interfaces with the world through the 6 sense bases. And the study on the process of dependent origination, these are the truths of life as natural processing of dependent origination. Then the Buddhism will last forever, and the Buddhism will never come to an end. The studies of the three subjects can be concluded as the truths of life within nature.
After making an investigation on the first 6 aspects of considerations, the last aspect of the 7th consideration is the application of the Four Noble Truths on the observation to conclude the whole analysis on the research on Dharma, which is the critical factors in the 7 factors of the Enlightenment.